This was their Retinette F, the French market one. Now this is a bit unusual because we've got a mix of features. The rewind is much like the earlier cameras. The frame counter is like the later cameras. This body has chrome trims top and bottom. The front casting, because this doesn't have a light value shutter, is similar to that on the early cameras with the contour shutters, but the f-stop sequence runs the other way. So it's worth taking this one apart, I think, to see which of those cameras it resembles most in its internal components. So I'll start by removing the lens and shutter assembly. Which I have only very recently put back in place. And I'll pop those lens and shutter assembly to one side since they're all serviced and they're ready to go. The camera body. We always start as before, something through the rewind fork, spin the knob off with the fingers, 2 screws at the rewind end. One screw at the film advance end, or the frame counter end. Lift the top cover off carefully. We have the film release button. Now this has a collar there which is not present on the other cameras. Okay. Let me fetch in the parts from the early camera and see how that compares. This is the lever from the early camera, and that very closely matches that, but we don't have the spacer on the early Compur Rapid equipped cameras. So there's certainly a difference there straight away. We've got a collar there which would limit the travel of this button. Otherwise it's the same as the early variety. The shutter release button lifts off the shaft and will remove the shutter release shaft and hopefully not lose its return spring, assuming it has one. Well, I see no spring. It might be in the body, or there may be no spring, or it may be somewhere else. So there's a difference there. The cocking action. Okay, so here, this is quite different. This piece is much the same, but here we see that it's stepped up over this other piece, and it's joined by 2 screws. Let's remove those screws and see what that looks like underneath. Now they're slotted, so they make for some adjustment. So that means that you could adjust the cocking stroke, if you like, at that point. This piece, it's cut with a notch on the end, much like the later cameras, but instead of going into a slot there, it goes into a much bigger slot. So that's quite different. Under the top cover, well, let's strip this stuff down. So I'll remove the strap lugs. At both ends. I'm going to pull that curtain across. It's a bit high contrast there at the moment. that's better. Oh, that screw really does not want to come out. That's going to take some thumping with hammers and things, I think. Let's see how we go. Applying some torsion on that screwdriver. I'll give it a couple of taps with the hammer. That was all it required. That screw came out. This chrome trim plate can come off the top. I'll take the rewind shaft out because I want to clean those pieces. Screws are tight on this camera. This piece can come off. So there's this is all quite gooey with dried out grease. That grease is very possibly original. It's fairly likely no one's been in here. Okay, so let's just remove a few bits here. This screw off the top of our release lever and its spring. The screw that holds the pawl in place and the return spring for the pawl and the little spacer that goes underneath the pawl. They can come off. This screw can come out here that holds the film advance. It just holds this top bush in place. At the bottom of the camera, I want the leatherettes off, so there's the scalpel. As usual, we start with the film advance lever. I've got to get underneath that disc. That would appear to have never been off before, I would say. That looks like the original adhesive. That was just the film advance spring winding off there because there's nothing left to catch it. Two screws hold the back catch cover tripods around in place. They're coming off without any drama. And its return spring is present and not even mutilated. The leatherette is going to come off easily, I'd say, looking at the state of that. That adhesive has given up the ghost. It has expired. Okay, so the leatherette's off. Absolutely no fighting at all. Let's get this chrome trim off. Our release lever can lift out now. Its spring at the tip here is a little bit bent out of shape. just like its mates were. This one's worse if anything. Let's have a look at the tripod socket, see if the screws are loose. They are not. The rewind button, let's have that out. Nothing unusual there. The rewind button catch, you can have that out. Nothing unusual there. Okay, let's get this round to the neutral position. The neutral position is where this cutout, this bigger cutout in this disc, is in line with the piece here, which would be where the lock lever would be in a retina. The lock lever's job is to lock the film advance when it's reached the end of its travel, when it's reached number 1. The Retinette Type 022 does not have such a feature. Okay, so that can come out. Let's have a look at this. It's very, very gummy with dried out grease. That will need to be all cleaned out. Let's just check the state of that. It's nice and firm on the end of the shaft. Okay, open the back of the camera. We've got a screw here in that slot on the sprocket that drives the sprocket from the shaft. Take that screw out. It's doing its best to fall into the camera body. Push that shaft out. Just there's our shaft. And lift the sprocket out. The top bush for the film advance has come out. Here's the clutch. The sprocket can come out. And there's its metal bush at the base. Camera body's pretty much stripped down. Not much more to take out. Let's take our front plate off and have a look at this shutter release, because that's quite different to the other cameras. The cocking action would appear to be quite similar, but we'll have to find out. Let's take this off anyway. Now, some Bright Spark has polished the alloy front of this camera. That's not standard, and that was not done by taking it off the camera. And you can tell that because if you look underneath, you can see the original grey paint down here where it was not convenient to polish it away. Okay, so there's our shutter release, and we had no return spring on our shutter release shaft because it didn't need one. This piece has a return spring on it, so that's something that you won't see with the other cameras. This piece, this cocking piece here, appears to be the same as the other cameras. Okay, so our shutter release was the difference there. We'll take out those 4 screws and lift this plate off the front just for ease of cleaning. There's not really anything exciting left in there. Those screws are a little bit unusual. They're a funny colour. They almost look like zinc plated. And we've got 2 screws here. There's no special reason that those screws should have a different plating than what you'd normally see. Normally they'd be nickel plated. Okay, this slides out. And here's our rack, if you like. It's different to the other 2 cameras in that it doesn't have that angled slot that you hook into, nor does it have a screw hole and bush that you screw into, so it's certainly a third option. This one has the baffle in the back of the body, just like the other camera. And there's a film chip floating around loose there. A film chip is the pieces of film between the sprocket holes on a 35mm film. And there's another one. They get stripped out when people get to the end of the film and give it one good wind for good measure at the end of the film, even though they're not going to get another frame out of it. Okay, so this needs to be cleaned. There's a bit of dirty old grease there, and this business, well, of course that has no equivalent in the contour shuttered Retinette type 022s, so that I'll take apart and clean that separately as well. So there was a few surprises there. This business, I just didn't know how they'd arranged that, but we can now see it. And this business with the cocking action, with that being split into two for adjustment, and with that shape there, which is like neither the early nor the late Retinette type 022s, was a surprise. But that camera now is in tiny little pieces and will need to be cleaned and put back together eventually. Now the leatherettes on this one, that's coming loose. Now that's not good, and it may be that I can't get it all off. I'll have to have a look at that. Sometimes when they're like this they'll come off very easily, and other times they won't. Let's see how we get on. Frequently when these leatherettes are, even when they're quite loose, often they're stuck along that edge of the body moulding there. Where they're drawn tight over a corner like that, often they are stuck very well. We'll see how we get on with this one. It's just falling away. Now these light patches here, that's corrosion. That's a corrosion product, and you can see the same on the body here. That's where the aluminium is corroded underneath the leatherette, and as a result the adhesive's no longer sticking to anything. Most likely the leatherette on this side will be the same, so even though it looks like it's stuck down well, I have good reason to believe that it's going to come off, and it really does need to come off, because when they get into this state, sometimes you can tell just because they're a bit peeled up at the edges. They can go from that state where they look quite solid to falling off the camera in the space of a couple of days, just while your back's turned in a warm room or something. The leatherette on the camera back, I'm not going to disturb that. There's a couple of bumps there, but it's not flapping at the ends. It's probably not worth chasing that. So there's our camera body. The back catch moves smoothly. There's no obvious corrosion on there. I think with a touch of grease that'll work very nicely indeed. So that was our 20 type 022/7, the French market Retinette camera, and it's all in little pieces. It had a few surprises there, nothing particularly stunning, just worth taking note of, I suppose. Where things are, which parts were used in common, and where the differences were, which are, of course, only really makes a difference if the camera you're working on has something broken. It's very good to know exactly which model of camera you're going to need to pillage for parts. As you can see, I've got the body, the leatherettes back on the body, all the components have been cleaned. I'm ready to start reassembling this. So I'll start by putting the baffle back in the body. It's two notches, this one on the side lines up with this projection here. So it just drops in there like that. Then we have this front plate. This needs to go together. I need to put the shutter trigger back on there. There's its 2 screws and its return spring. So I'll use some molybdenum paste here. You could use graphite grease or anything else that you like the look of. Just running it through those slots. And this should sit on there just like that. Looking to see how that, the return spring shouldn't cause me a problem. I'll just get these shoulder screws in place. Tighten them up. Check that this moves freely. Here's its return spring. It's got a hook over that post there. Easier said than done. Oh, well, just about fell on in the end. Here's the shutter release. Alright, the body. Now we've got to put the little rack piece in place. So I'm going to be generously coat this with a bit of grease. Fit this in place here on that slope. Just put this back into the body. I'll slide that piece up towards the centre so that it's not coming adrift. Now the screws that held this, there were 3 screws. Looked unusual in their colour. I think they're actually chrome plated. They're certainly not nickel plated. You would expect nickel plated screws in this position. So it's a bit of a mystery as to why this model got chrome plated screws. Presumably the factory was just out of the ones that they'd normally use. And for some reason thought these would be a good idea instead. We have 1 panhead screw there. So I'll tighten those 4 screws up. Now I was going to put the gear in the front here, but if I do that I'm only going to have to take it out to get it timed correctly at this stage, so I'm just going to leave that exactly as it was. I'm not going to put the front plate on yet. Next we want our release lever. With its 2 screws and the spring. Now this spring was a little bit out of shape. it's easy to damage that during assembly, so it's quite possible it was slightly out of shape from very early in its life. Okay, so I'm going to put a watt of molybdenum paste down there and down there where the shaft for the release lever runs, and a watt on this surface where that spring will run. If I can get it to coat nicely. There must be some lump on there. As a result, that is not wiping on smoothly. What's that? Is there a bump in the casting? There is. It's gone now. Okay. Taking this release lever, dropping it in there, being careful not to catch the spring on the edge of the body. Feed it up through the casting at the top. You may need to poke that through with a tip of your tweezers to encourage it. Put its return spring in place and then start the screw. I find it easier to start them with my fingers typically than to use a screwdriver. You've got to get the screw running in square, and it's not straightforward because you're going into a split shaft. Just wind some tension on there. Check that that moves nicely, and it appears to. And then we can get the film advance shaft in. I'm going to get some grease onto this film advance shaft. I want something on that between this bush and the shaft, and this stuff is quite tacky. It's dark grey, I believe. It's got molybdenum in it, amongst other things. But being tacky, it tends to stay on the shaft. It doesn't get washed away easily. I'll take some synthetic grease, run it over these little teeth here. That's the release lever runs over those, and that helps controls the advance action, so that you can only move the film advance lever in the forward direction while you're moving when you go to advance the film. You can't inch the lever. You can only go forward till it reaches the end of its stroke, and then it must return. You can't get it halfway returned and then push it forward again. It's got to return all the way. Okay, so here's the take-up spool and its bush. The bush goes in the round hole, not the hole with the slot in it. And the slot goes to the top of the camera. Let's just prop this up on something. That'll probably do. Okay, so we can drop in our film advance lever. I'm just making sure that that spring tucks away nicely to the side there and doesn't get buckled up. This should drop down through that bush. Just like that. And I'm going to line my holes up where the screws go into the casting. These are the short screws. I'm only going to put 2 of the short screws in at the moment, because I want to put a longer screw in there to hold things together when I'm getting the film advance assembled. So one there, one there. So I'll put a long one in this position once I've wound a full wind of tension on there, before I assemble the rest of the mechanism at the top. Okay, so far so good. Film advance mechanism at the top. First I need to assemble the clutch. Here are the clutch components. I'll take some of my gooey grease, run that around the inside of the clutch. Where's my pliers?